there was a sense in the Cold War, and in general, you might say, after the Second World War, that there really were big differences between good and evil, that we couldn't do without a sense of right and wrong, both because in the absence of that, moral monsters had grown up that actually dwarfed the kinds of killers that had been there before the Second World War and before that loss of faith, but also because real moral decisions had to be made, and people realized they had to have some basis for making life and death decisions. So there have been a variety of attempts to reconstruct norms, and one of the most influential is the view of John Rawls, long a professor at Harvard, who gave us a way of trying to reconstruct notions of justice. So let's talk some about the problem we've been discussing, the problem of normativity, the problem posed by two-level theories that seem to banish normative terms like good, should, ought, right, wrong, just, unjust, and so on, at least don't have them anywhere in the base level, and so it's not clear to what extent they can be taken seriously. You could argue after the Second World War that it was really the loss of faith in these concepts that led to some of the moral horrors of the 20th century, and so the question arose, how can we recover normativity? And we've seen already a variety of attempts to do that, in the existentialists, in Iris Murdoch, and a variety of other thinkers. Well, that's the kind of thing we're going to be focusing on here. Really, during the 1950s, and then especially during the 1970s, there was a movement to reconstruct norms, reconstruct senses of right and wrong, and of justice and injustice. And one of the key moments here is John Rawls' publication in 1971 of a long book, A Theory of Justice. It was followed shortly thereafter by Nozick's Anarchy, State, and Utopia, which won the National Book Award. And the two laid out, really in some sense, theories of justice that have been motivating in American politics from that time until at least very recently. Rawls giving you a picture, an attempted justification of a liberal welfare state. And Nozick giving you a sort of libertarian or conservative picture of property rights and of justice that was meant to be an alternative to that. Well, there were other sorts of effects. The Helsinki Accords that we'll talk about in 1975, and then the election of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, both of whom ran on campaigns largely of restoring a sense of moral values. But today I want to talk, actually, do I want to do this? Do I want to talk about John Rawls, or do I want to just skip ahead and talk about the 60s? Oh, all right, I'll do this. I'm committed. I'm already into this. Might as well. And next time we'll have lots of pictures and lots of fun things. Anyway, all right, back to John Rawls, who is, despite his profundity, philosophically, not very fun. Some philosophical writers are really great writers, and part of their appeal is that they're fun to read. John Rawls is not like that. And if you attempted to do today's reading, you realize. In fact, here's a hint. If Rawls is on the final exam, read the thing and say, is this really boring? If the answer is yes, it's probably Rawls. And I don't mean that as a criticism of the quality of the ideas. But in this case, you know, he's recognized as great despite the writing, not because of the writing. So don't take him as your ideal how to write philosophy. Anyway, or for that matter, anything else. Now, he talks primarily about the question of distributive justice. That's a question of how the goods and responsibilities of society are to be distributed among its members. There are certain good things that arise as a result of social cooperation, but there are also certain burdens. How should we distribute those among the members of society? For example, somebody has to pay taxes. Well, who should be paying taxes and how much? There are also benefits, and so those benefits, let's say military contracts. How should we decide who gets military contracts? And that kind of thing. So there are goods to be distributed, there are also responsibilities to be distributed. Now, a lot of those, Robert Nozick makes much of this point, arise attached to particular people, but some of them don't. That is to say, if I grow tomatoes in my garden, well, in some sense, I'm the one who grew them, right? I have a special attachment to them. But if we're thinking in terms of military contracts or in terms of taxation in general, then it's not obvious that there is any particular starting point. It looks like those are more abstract distributional questions. Now, the welfare state itself, at least in theory and to some extent in practice, had been there since the 1930s and really earlier, since the 1800s with Bismarck in Germany. In the United States, it was primarily the creature of the New Deal. The 1960s greatly expanded through Johnson's Great Society programs, and we'll talk later about the details of those. But in general, the role of government changed. It changed from trying to protect its citizens from harm, the first obligation of government, and also the second, providing a sort of framework for freedom in the Coolidge or earlier, the sort of 19th century Republican sense. Two, guaranteeing their welfare. But guaranteeing one person's welfare, as we've seen, restricts the freedom of others. If you have a right to a house, for example, then somebody has to build you that house. Somebody else has to pay for it. And so there really is a trade-off. Now, the 1960s saw a dramatic shift in the way people in this country, at any rate, but in many Western democracies, made those trade-offs. It was a significant shift in the size and role of government. Vietnam pushed defense spending higher, but only temporarily. Social spending, on the other hand, increased dramatically, and it began a long and lasting pattern of increase. Here you see FDR signing the Social Security bill. Here you see Johnson signing the bill that created the Medicare system. And here you see federal spending. Ever since, well, really, this chart goes all the way from 1790 up until 2010. And you see their dramatic increase for a long time, other than the period of warfare, really until the First World War. As you can see, federal spending was insignificant. The average person really had no contact with the federal government, whatever. But starting in the Wilson administration, and the two big spikes there are World War I and World War II, you see this pattern of increase, which now federal spending is up to 24%. Well, actually, it was in 2010. I think it's about the same now. Moreover, the pattern has changed. As you can see, the blue line represents defense spending, and from 1940 until about 1970, that was far larger than domestic spending, but ever since, domestic spending, the red line here, has been significantly higher than defense spending. And there you can see defense versus non-defense spending, again, non-defense in the red line and defense spending in the black line. Well, all of that has led to a dramatic change. So here, for example, is a chart about where a dollar spent by the federal government goes. In 2014, 49% of it goes to major entitlements: Medicare, Medicaid, other forms of health care, as well as Social Security. About a quarter goes to medical expenses, about a quarter goes to Social Security, 20% goes to income security and other welfare benefits, 18% goes to national defense, and 6% goes to interest on the debt. And so that's a dramatic shift. Basically, before 1930, the leftmost three things would just not be there. It would be primarily national defense, law enforcement within the country, and so on. And so here's another way of looking at that. Defense at the bottom of the chart, and then Social Security, Medicare, anti-poverty programs, and so on, growing massively in the middle. In any case, all of that has changed dramatically, partly as a result of the changes in the 1960s. Medicaid is currently the fastest growing major entitlement. At 87%, it's projected to grow over the next 10 years, but you can see Medicare and Social Security also expected to grow massively. And there you see the changes in federal welfare spending from the time in 1964 when Johnson declared war on poverty to the present day. Well, here's a little chart. What if a typical family spent money like the federal government? The median family income in the United States is $52,000. If they spent money like the federal government, they'd spend $60,000 a year, which means they'd put $8,400 on their credit cards, even though they're already $308,000 in debt. So that should make you feel good about things. Well, anyway, this little chart, I won't go through it in detail, but it shows the amounts per family of four that the federal government spends. And as you can see, the top items are Social Security at over $10,000, National Defense at $9,000, Medicare about $6,000, Medicaid over $4,000, welfare about $4,000, and so on. Now, we have made some progress against poverty, as these charts indicate. This is broken down by racial and ethnic group, but you can also see that most of the changes happened by 1970, and since then, advances against poverty have slowed down considerably. And here's a more detailed rate, or picture of poverty rates. There was a dramatic decline in the 50s and 60s, and then, since then, things have wobbled around sort of inconclusively, despite that vast increase in spending. Inequality, as measured by various things, declined dramatically from the 30s until about the late 60s. And since the late 60s in the US, and really all other Western countries, inequality has been increasing for reasons that remain somewhat controversial, but have surprisingly little to do, evidently, with which nation is concerned, which political party is in charge, and so on. In any event, the question we have to ask is this. The welfare state then went from really almost non-existent to then massive over the period of the last century. What, if anything, justifies it? It was, by the 1960s, it put into practice, and then has grown massively since. But by 1970, even though it was there, not only in the United States, but in many advanced countries, there was no theory behind it at all. According to the American founders, stemming ultimately from John Locke, there should really be a minimal state that protects people's rights and does very little else. In fact, a very early Supreme Court decision said it was never legitimate from the government to take from A and give to B, apart from some compelling national interest. Rousseau and Marx gave you a justification for socialism or communism, but what was the justification for the democratic welfare state? It was that gap that John Rawls was trying to fulfill. And so his conception of justice is of justice as fairness. He says the principles of social justice are those that people who are free, who are rational, who are self-interested, and who are equal would accept to govern their association. So imagine that we all get together on equal terms, freely, thinking about our own self-interest, decide to design a society. What principles of justice would we build into that society? His theory is a version of social contract theory. We've talked a little bit about that in the past. Basically, the idea is government would be justified if people would voluntarily agree to live under it. And so it contrasts the state of nature, a state without government, with government. It says you choose government because the state of nature would be bad in various ways. Well, if you would choose government, what kinds of rules would you agree to? And so he says we've got to think about an ideal circumstance of choice, and then what people would actually choose in that circumstance. His ideal circumstance is called the original position. Imagine that you know everything there is to know about human psychology, society, about economics, about politics, but you don't know anything about yourself. You don't know whether you're a man or a woman, whether you're old or young, whether you're tall or short, smart or stupid, white or black, etc., etc. You know nothing about yourself. You don't know anything even about your own conception of the good. This is what he calls the veil of ignorance. The idea here is for it to be a fair choice. A better way of thinking of it, I think, is not to think, suppose I didn't know anything about myself, but imagine that I'm representing somebody else. I've been hired as somebody else's agent, but I don't know who I'm representing. Then I've got to make a choice that will make sense no matter what that person's personal characteristics are. Well then, here's the idea. We're going to choose principles, and we should be concerned that everyone benefits from this arrangement. And so, he says, here are the principles people would choose. First, a principle of maximal equal basic liberty. We would all choose to retain the right to have an input to the process of political participation. But secondly, and here's the key one, we would choose to arrange social and economic inequalities so that they are reasonably expected to be to everyone's advantage. That's called the difference principle. They would also have to be attached to positions and offices open to all. That's a principle of equal opportunity. And so he argues that what we should be concerned about in society is not inequality per se, but the welfare of the least advantaged people in society. Look at the people in the bottom. In short, he's saying, don't worry about the rich, the top 1%. Worry about the poor. What determines whether a society is just or not is whether it helps the poor live as good a life as they can possibly